So this issue of where the slack in the space is, and it got me thinking about whether or not it's really how surplus space is actually necessary for organizing these systems. And that there's this desperate need for optimization that's going on in logistical systems, but not in all of these spaces. So it got me thinking about this idea that form follows finance that we always hear, but sometimes it's the form of the system, not actually the structure or the built environment or the design of the software in this case. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an idea about where the slack in the system is, if it's not really, if we're looking at the form being the system design, not the built form as where the optimization really lies. Whoever wants to jump in.
I think in terms of, to me, the shocking thing about the slack in the kind of return policy is how throwaway it's been for how long. I mean, when we're talking like, revenue margins that are like minimal, that are being like, that are so coveted, and then there's like an entire category of objects that is just like too idiosyncratic to even handle, and therefore like no optimization is just kind of even dreamed of, and only now we're getting to the idea of like how we might streamline getting stuff back. So yeah, I mean it's maybe not the fact that there has been slack, it's just the size of that slack has been sort of shocking in my research. To even think about a company like Home Depot just now getting to having 4, recuperation facilities that start handling this. It's a scale issue, I think, for me.
Yeah, for sure, because I think like, I'm thinking like with Lida's work, or also with these gesture algorithms, there's like a way that you sort of intervene in them as like single people trying to do small projects in systems that were designed for much larger things. So like a gesture tracking thing makes no sense for like one person. It's really about 1 million people or whatever. And so I think the same is true for the return policies or something.
Yeah, everything's a prototype
in
some way. Like we function with a prototype world. Yeah.
So but then somehow like being very small is like a kind of advantage, I guess, or it like produces possibilities.
I can just add. I mean, speaking of prototypes, another component of the kind of looseness of something like Walmart's ability to build a building every few days is that the design of the documents that make buildings happen are underspecified. Like maybe to borrow from management theory, they're loosely coupled systems, so they allow easy interfacing because they're not overdetermined. So there's this kind of ability to quickly adapt to the specificities of a site, its handedness, its location to infrastructure. So a company like Walmart, who has something like 5,000 stores in the U.S. and continues to build really rapidly, they really only have 10 kind of core types, and those are designed to be really kind of generic in one way, but then really specific in others. And I find it interesting that it's the actual building envelope that is the slack. So there's this buffer around the building that is a kind of soft zone that then gets translated to make it happen, basically.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I find that theme very, very important. Okay, questions from the audience. Yes, please.
I think this is a really interesting component to it. I think the clip that I showed of the Kiva system, this mic is really fun because it has an incredible kind of reverb. I feel like we're in some amazingly large space. So the Kiva simulation, which somehow shows this like scrambled warehouse. I mean, for me, I think that one is, I think that highlights some of the challenges and of dealing with this, because I think that requires a managerial ability to read something that I don't think people have. Like, I think that's a simulation that is only capable of being managed automatically, through another layer of algorithms. So I think that the kind of notion of what a manager is becomes further and further distance from the actual process. And so I think that, like, those warehouse, one of the things I didn't talk about with the Kiva system, because of the way that it uses the space of the warehouse to basically reorganize the contents of the warehouse around demand, what you end up with having, as I understand it, over the course of, let's say, a period of time, goods that are in higher demand will migrate to the perimeters, closer to the picking stations, and the goods that are less in demand will sort of migrate to this kind of frozen core of the building. And so in a certain sense, what you see with those, like if you let those simulations run, it's more or less a portrait of collective consumer desire, but it's encrypted. Like, we can't sort of decrypt what that looks like, but it's, in a way, it's this, I was excited about seeing what Curtis was working on, because it's this reverse reading of a series of outcomes. But then I think the question of, like, how decisions get made around that, I mean, I think that's what the real question would be, like, how does the simulation get instrumentalized in the context, say, of managing a workforce in the space of a warehouse? And so I think that I mean, to some extent, management has always been about simulation, and so I think that the one of the maybe difficulties of increased simulation is an increased mediation, an increased distance from the consequences of managerial work. So for example, with the real estate process of Walmart's what I know best, so I keep talking about that. The way that they used to locate their buildings by, like, flying over landscapes and saying, like, there's one, let's build it there. And now they do that by using prospecting software that through sort of inputting performance simulations will say, these are the 5 building locations in this part of the world that you could build. And then basically through a really, like, totally automated process, you can then start enacting the process of encumbering and entitling and all that. So I think that it's the simulation facilitates and catalyzes urban transformation in increasingly frictionless ways, apparently, even though, of course, that's producing all sorts of frictions on its other side. And so so I think that then becoming more and more cognizant of that, I think, is really significant from the kind of, like, architectural or planning side of things. I tried to buy you some time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I would say, like, for me personally, is like less about anti-simulation as much as, like, this idea that I think we like already live with our simulations, and our simulations have certain kinds of agency that's different, but alongside the agency we have. And so it's like thinking about what that means, I guess, to be a person living with your simulation, that's both of which are, like, acting on the world in certain ways. But I think the other thing that I think is sort of present in something like gesture tracking or, like, analytics in general is the idea that, like, I think in order to simulate a person, you have to, like, rethink how a person is constituted, and I think that's why it's sort of important that it's like Amazon that's doing this, because Amazon is an expert in logistics in a certain sense, and so they sort of reconsider what life means as a kind of logistical problem. And so there's, to me, like, I don't know, that's intrinsic in this idea of simulation, is not only that it's like a model of a person, but it's also like a rewriting of subjectivity more generally.
I think I think throughout the projects that I presented, there's a kind of a gradient and I think around the word instrumentalization specifically, like starting with stock, like as a kind of like a useless toil of, like, me being the simulation in some way of, like, whatever the system, and then to, like, careful crates, where it's like it's very much a kind of, like, resistant positioning of the simulation. And then with the video game and materials and applications, like, it gets very earnest, right? So it's like the idea of, like, how to clarify the communication between object and person. It really lends itself to imagining that as a product. In fact, Amazon rolled out not too long ago an AR experience of objects that tries to close exactly that gap, right? Like the gap that specifications create, where you have to be reading how many grams something is or what's the exact size, and you end up with kind of like a comedic realm of Instagram posts of people that bought like miniature tents and try to go camping, and or bought like a rug for the room, and it ended up being like just big enough for your mouse. So like that video game was essentially kind of pointing to like simulating kind of like object to person relationship. But what's interesting about it is kind of like how undigital it gets so quickly, that in such a way, like for returns, there's actually no software that can handle the idiosyncrasies of a returned object. Like a million things could have happened to that object, and there's softwares don't even have the like a kind of reverse logistics side. So when Home Depot actually started creating its return centers, or bigger return centers, it had to come up with its own software in order to handle it, because really the only way that you can kind of streamline this is by human observation of the object, what might have, whether, an analysis of all of its kinks and all of its things that might have happened to it. So it just starts to get really into like tactility very quickly, both in the receiving end of the returns, but also in the customer experience, where that's in some way like the things that are missing, like weight and tactility are, and true color resolutions are maybe why some, like many objects are returned in some way. Like you can't quite gauge how heavy something is or how what its texture is really, like through digital tools. So yeah, I mean there's a big gap, and there's a lot of room to come up with the thing to be like definitely like sold to Amazon as like the thing that kind of bridges that gap. It seems like very productive space and returns.
Thank you. One more question? Do you want to?
Okay, all right. I was actually just going to go back to maybe a question that Jessica had. More questions.
Okay, if they're fast.
I was just going to go back to maybe a question that Jesse ended on in his presentation about like the choice of design language and how you represent these logistical systems that are maybe at a scale or a degree of abstraction that's kind of illegible to the human eye. And it's kind of really struck me that the three groups of projects that you guys talked about deal with this problem in very different ways, where logistics is represented either through stock images or through maybe architectural axons that we're familiar with within our field. To, I think, Curtis, in your work, I was really struck by the fact that ultimately these drawings are translated in paint in something that feels very, very tangible and traditional. And so I was wondering if you guys could maybe speak to those choices a little bit more and how you choose to represent this information.
I mean, I think for me, in this case, I feel like this is going to be a bad answer, but it had to like be, it had to produce like a compelling decorative object, was like kind of my primary motivation, because that actually like produced a certain enthusiasm from other people to participate in it. And so like the idea that it's like, I think on a certain level, like to me at least, they're just like compelling objects in a way, and I think other people felt the same way. And so like actually a lot of the work that I didn't show was like working through various iterations of that in order to like design that system such that it would produce objects that would elicit that kind of excitement, I guess, was sort of how I arrived at the aesthetic object.
I think, at least for stock specifically, it was related to notions of access and resources. So it ultimately had to, like, the representation choices were to maximize any of that access to, like, those materials, momentary access to materials. So trying to create kind of like big landscape proposals out of like a single object, or like an entire room proposal out of like a single surface material texture. Just like kind of playing this game of both having like limited resource to the material access, but translating that into even like a digital limitation, just kind of like trying to do the most you can with like a single photo, or like very, just kind of like a Photoshop exchange, and limiting yourself to that. So it was more about kind of putting a hand behind your back and like, that's it, you only have this one photo. And you have to rely on like the accumulation of the catalog over time, or relying on the maximizing of like that singleness, that oneness. That's the representation.
I think for me, one of the challenges for trying to document these logistical systems at the kind of territorial scale is the temporal dimension. Or even at the architectural scale. So a 1 million square foot warehouse, for example, that turns over 90% of its contents in 24 hours becomes really a difficult representational challenge. Like how do you explain the bathtub draining while you're filling it at the same time? And so I think for me the axon or the isometric projection became a way to think through that, because it was a way to try to show different moments in time, borrowing from graphic novelists, borrowing from other people who manipulate that. So I mean, that's I think one interest. The other is the sort of imagined authority of the technical drawing that allows the seemingly plausible presentation of things that don't make any sense, like some of the projects from the Seoul project. And then the other, I think, interest in the axon is its military origins. And so the logistical world, coming from quartermastery, coming from the provisioning and movement of things in time and space, comes with military perspective, which was this kind of way of seeing things simultaneously, and the parallel projection drawing is part of that story. So I think for me, these are all sort of ongoing interests in that particular format as it pertains to logistics. I mean, I guess for me, part of what. Yeah, I think the, for me, ability to admit that I find these things totally seductive was useful. So to kind of give myself permission to be like, I know this is terrible, but I love it, was like helpful to basically find a way into that, and not to say that like somehow that means surrendering to it, but that one can sort of like admit a fascination that is, and admit a kind of pleasure in engaging it while not surrendering a kind of desire to engage it productively or critically.
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of one of the goals of the software, was this idea that this is like an invisible process that you can depict, basically. But I think also, like in the kind of painting work, it's gotten to a sort of strange point, because in the initial ones, I was choosing all the colors. I was making decisions about the way they sort of turned out, and over that process came to understand this like huge range of viscosity, and it's just latex house paint, but it's very different viscosities depending on the color. And so those different viscosities like produce different fidelities of the worker's line as they draw it. And so like in the later ones, we've been choosing colors as a group, and choosing colors particularly in the degree to which they like preserve or don't preserve the fidelity of the worker's work, which kind of leads to like less good-looking things, but also like for me kind of maybe more interesting, because it like then means the work is actually like a sort of weirdly like a kind of internal form of communication between these 8 people, and like not actually about anyone else seeing it, in some, which I think maybe is kind of problematic, but also that's just the way it's sort of evolved.
I think in some way, this might be like the worst answer ever, but in some way it is actually like, it's a bit biographical almost, in a way, like kind of like just giving yourself the right to have the project because you access it in whatever way you want. So yeah, I think for me it was very much about sort of access to resources, being a kind of solo practice. You just kind of find the smallest wedge, the smallest kind of conclusion in a project, and I think defining it as tactical is like the first big thing, where you don't have like a subject matter, or you don't have a sort of a, like a part of a discipline even. Like you just kind of choose a tactic and the smallest slice of a topic, and you just fully engage it with like whatever you have. It's like very different proposal than what our discipline is constructed as, and it's kind of, disciplinary differentiations between what one does and what another one does, we tend to use kind of big words for keywords for like our discipline, and sometimes it can just be like very, very small things that now look more like aesthetic tactics or tactics that then we kind of prototype and inflate onto a kind of practice, or like inflate onto a body of research, but it starts pretty small, maybe with a small observation. Sorry, really obvious thing to say.
So thank you very much, and I'm going to ask everyone to do 3 things. One is continue this conversation over lunch, which we will break for now. The second thing is come back after lunch for the 2 panels that are going to be after lunch. And the third thing is please thank our panelists for sharing their work with us this morning.